Before we get into the substance of what I'm going to be talking about, let me give some introductory remarks and a couple of little bonus thoughts, and then this way we can use the balance of the time on the meat of things. Tonight's main shiur is based on really two essays or two commentaries in a book by one of my teachers, Chacham Isaac Sassoon, which is called Destination Torah. Hopefully people are seeing that in legible form and not in mirror image form, and so it comes largely from a commentary of his on this week's Parashat, as well as one in Devarim, as well as related commentary and excursus from the JPS Torah and commentary, which to my mind is the best Chumash out there. It's certainly in English language. It combines a tremendous knowledge of biblical literature, rabbinic literature, modern scholarship, ancient Near East texts, and I think gives just a really great holistic take on searching for meaning within the text. And then in the back of each volume there are essays, well, they call them excurses, that are often really enlightening. And so I just recommend it as a go-to source for Torah study. They have for the 5 books. They also have for many of the prophets and writings, and also for the Haggadah, which is a fascinating one as well. So their publications, maybe in frum circles, aren't looked to as much as they should be, but they're really excellent resources. With that, a couple of quick points, again, before going into the meat of things. One that I kind of found interesting is a comment that JPS had in the mention of the verse in this week's Torah portion that tells us that one of the, so Moshe sends these scouts is probably a word, spy is probably not the best word, who are going to tour the land of Israel, one of whom is Hoshea bin Nun, whom we are told in this parasha, Moshe gives the name of Yehoshua, Joshua. And one of the interesting tidbits they mention is that the Yud at the beginning of Yehoshua is a God name. It's a reference to the 4-letter name of God, also known as the Tetragrammaton, for those of you who want really long words for short concepts. So the Yud there is a reference to that name. So interestingly, in Parashat Va'era in Exodus, we learn that God calls to Moshe and says, I am this 4-letter name, and this is a name that wasn't previously known. So Hoshea bin Nun, having been born in Egypt and prior to God's call to Moshe, could not possibly have had an original name of Yehoshua, if we assume that that God name wasn't available to even be a part of his name at the time. And so that becomes one thing that has to be explained in the Torah, which is how did he get this name if he was born before that name of God would have been known. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit. Another 2 pieces of recommended reading that we're not discussing, just that I think are really interesting. One is in the JPS, there's a excursus 38, which discusses, among other things, tzitzit, because that comes up at the end of this week's Torah portion, and is just a fascinating, eye-opening discussion, both of the symbolism behind the tzitzit, as well as the ancient Near Eastern equivalents and things like that. And the thing actually that I found most interesting there, which I think I mentioned once in a Dvar Torah at Sharei Ora, is that one of the rabbinic rules is that tzitzit are allowed to violate the concept of shatnez, and maybe even preferably are linen strings on woolen garments. or I might have reversed that, but I think I got that right, which is unusual because generally we don't wear garments that have that combination. And I always thought of shotness as being a forbidden combination. I thought it was considered something like an unnatural combination. But in fact, quite the opposite. The shotness is a holy combination. And there's a verse that says, don't make these wool and linen garments, shema tikadesh, lest it becomes sanctified. And in fact, the garb of the Kohanim included shotness as well. And so that changed my view of what shotness was about, but also demonstrates that what tzitzit are is a form of priestly garb, and an idea of having all of Israel wear priestly garb. Interesting and only tangentially related, in the chat I put in a link to an article I'd written a while back about women and tzitzit, which talks about the history, and I argue probably original rabbinic law was that women were obligated in tzitzit, and what happened and how I think some misconceptions came out into that law. So that's just something, if you care to, there's a link in the chat and for your own reading pleasure. With that, let's go to the main course, which is a discussion in particular of the verses involved after the spies come. The spies isn't the best word. The scouts come back. They give a report. The people are scared about whether or not they can go into the land of Israel. God gets upset. God says that God's going to kill all the people and make Moses into a great nation. And Moses doesn't like that idea, and he starts to plea with God not to do that. And so we're going to get into a couple of the points about what he says in that plea. And particularly interested in the idea that comes up here and in other places about God's visiting punishment of people from the parents to the children. And so that's kind of what I'm most interested in exploring here. So let's take a look here. Everyone can hopefully see my screen now. And we're looking first at the verses from this week's parasha. I'll read mostly in English, and I'm going to throw in some of the Hebrew for what I consider key and interesting phrases or things that maybe there's more nuance to be found in the Hebrew. So Moshe says, now, Yigdal na koach Adonai. Let my Lord's strength prevail, as you stated. The Lord is slow to anger and abundant of kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression. V'nakeh lo yinakeh, which I'll translate not acquitting. I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. Who visits the iniquities of the ancestors on children up to the third and fourth generations. Now this is somewhat familiar from this story, but as we'll get into a little bit more, a slightly elongated version of the same concepts coming from the book of Exodus becomes a mainstay of our penitential prayers during the Yamim Noraim, during the 10 days of repentance. A couple of points to what Moshe is saying here that I think are interesting to note. That Moshe, when asking God basically to hold back punishment, asks God, Yigdal na koach, let your strength become great, which is counterintuitive on some level, because usually we think of strength as manifesting in smiting, in destroying. But what's clear here, and I have in footnote 1 Rashbam, who enunciates this clearly, is that for God and for anyone, holding back on a response to anger is an expression of strength. And Rashbam refers to the same verse that we see in a relatively well-known teaching in Pirkei Avot, which is also in my footnote 2, which is Ben Zoma said, who is strong? One who conquers his emotions as it says, one who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and one who rules one's emotions is better than one who seizes a city. And so it's very interesting and powerful, I think, that Moshe's appeal to God for forgiveness is an appeal to God's strength of character, one might say, rather than strength of what God could potentially do. The other very interesting phrase we have here is vinake lo yinake, which my teacher, Rabbi Price, used to talk about how oftentimes in Hebrew you have the phrase to brick a brick, meaning you have the same word twice and it means to do something. Here we have the opposite formula, which is to not brick a brick. In other words, vinake lo yinake means whatever nake is something that God doesn't do. And so there's different ways to look at it, and we'll see some reflections of this as we go on. Vinake lo yinake could mean, just God doesn't forgive or acquit or wipe away sin. Or if you want to read it a little bit more with different inflection, so to speak, that it doesn't say that God doesn't completely acquit, just, God doesn't acquit, but, here's some ways that God might go light in different ways. Very interesting as we scroll down and see the more famous formulation of this type of concept, which comes from the book of Exodus. This is after the golden calf, and Moshe again pleads for God to forgive the people, and also asks God to understand God's nature. And this is what God says. God comes down and says, as we all have sung many, many a time, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. God is a merciful and gracious Lord, bestowing kindness on thousands of generations. And again, we have vinake lo yinake. Although, quite conspicuously, if you're in shul, you'll notice the song, no chesed lav, no avon v'pesha v'chata'a vinake. And you see Will giving the excellent demonstration of that note. And so the rabbis and the liturgists are, at the very least, taking some license by taking the phrase vinake lo yinake, which means God doesn't nake, and instead ends our statement by saying that God bestows kindness and forgives iniquity, and what seems to be does acquit. It's to say the least a very daring thing that we do with those verses. By the way, I should mention, if people have questions or comments, you're welcome to unmute yourself and jump in. I reserve the right to defer answering a question if appropriate. Okay, so here we are again at the end of these verses. We have a statement that God visits the iniquities of the ancestors on the children up to the third and fourth generations. A plain read of this text, I think, suggests that probably what's going on is we first have the list of all the things that God is forgiving and does kindness, etc. And then it seems to me vinake lo yinake is almost a turning point. It says, yeah, but God doesn't acquit, and in fact God punishes onto the third and fourth generations. That's one way of reading it. And if that's the case, and if this idea of God visiting the sins of the parents onto the children is kind of a bad and harsh thing, then it begs the question, why does Moshe use those words in asking God for forgiveness? And that's something we're going to explore. I want to mention a kind of meta issue here, which is here we have a couple of verses, and we're going to see a number of times where this phrase about visiting the sins of the parents on the children. Anytime you have several places where the same words or phrases or ideas come up, that is an opportunity to help us understand each text. One of the things we can do is we can look at one text to enlighten us as to the meaning of another. But that comes with a big caveat, because sometimes verses and texts might use very similar phrases and very similar ideas, but to explore other ideas that might be different or at tension with each other. And so we have a kind of challenge of both comparing and contrasting the texts, because we might be best to learn about one from the other directly, or to say, hey, look at how different these two things are. What are the different concepts behind them? So my teacher, Chacham Sassoon, on whom I've based much of this study, one of the things that I learned most from is the importance of allowing each text to breathe for itself. While it's always well and good to use one text to inform our understanding of the other, that can only go so far, because we don't want to impose our ideas from one text to another. We want to make sure that we're allowing each text to live and breathe on its own as well. So that's kind of the meta idea here. So the question on the floor at the moment is, if God's punishment of the third and fourth generations is kind of a harsh nature, then why does Moshe Rabbeinu bring it up? And there's one of the strategies we could use is to say, well, maybe if Moshe is bringing it up, it is in fact some kind of element of mercy to it. And a number of people go in that direction, and partially based on an analysis that we see in Rashi about that. So on Exodus 34:7, which is the 13 attributes that we saw from the golden calf incident, we have Rashi saying on the phrase "v'nakeh lo ni'nakeh," that God doesn't acquit. Rashi says that the plain meaning of that is that it implies God does not entirely forgive iniquity, but rather exacts payment, meaning the punishment, slowly. So the idea here being that rather than coming down on someone with a hammer for doing something wrong, that God kind of spreads out the punishment. And I think based on the succeeding phrase of God punishing the later generations, it comes up with this idea that perhaps when God punishes later generations, that is kind of spreading out the punishment over many generations, and therefore makes it lighter in some ways. That is something that Rashi actually doesn't ask this question that we're asking. He doesn't bring up the point here, but a number of the commentaries do look at it this way. I have a couple of commentaries that I list here, like it, including one in the footnote, but let's take a look at the Bechor Shor, because I think it's the most succinct and understandable of that outlook. So the Bechor Shor says, since Moshe mentions God's visiting the iniquities of the ancestors on children, we learn that this too is a quality of mercy. Now notice he's kind of backing into one point. He says, well, if Moshe mentions it, it must be that Moshe is using it as a plea for mercy. So how do we understand this? And he says, because God doesn't exact full payment from the first generation or second generation until the fourth generation, suggesting that everything gets spread out or maybe even possibly delayed to next generations, especially if you think, as we're going to discuss a little bit later, that if a later generation repents, they might avoid punishment. That would make this idea even more merciful and have more potential for helping people out. But overall, the idea here is that Moshe's plea for forgiveness, or Moshe's plea before God, may use the words visits the iniquity of the parents onto the children, because that basically causes a delay, at least, and maybe an amelioration of the punishment. So, in fact, we see that God accepts Moshe's plea. The verse says, Salachti kidvarecha, I have forgiven as you have asked. And then God says, your children will wander the wilderness for 40 years and will carry your faithlessness until the last of your carcasses lie in the wilderness. So basically God is saying, rather than killing everyone off in one fell swoop, God is going to let pretty much everyone live. The generation that has sinned will die out in the desert, and then the next generation will go into the land of Israel. And you could read that in a way as having a certain burden on the progeny, because now they're stuck in the desert for 40 years, among other things. So this could be a realization of this idea that that by spreading some of the effect of the sin on the later generations, it becomes less harsh towards the people who have sinned. So this is one theory that says that visiting the iniquities, when Moshe asks, he's asking God to visit the iniquities on the children, because that will ameliorate at least the punishment. There is, however, a sticky wicket, as we said. Sometimes when you look at different texts, you see different ideas, which might suggest different ways of reading things. And so we're going to take a look now at some verses from the Aseret HaDiborot, the 10 declarations, more commonly referred to as 10 commandments, where we have a similar phrase. So God says, don't bow down to idols nor worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, who Elkanah, poked avon avot al banim, al shilishim ve'al ribeim lisonai. Visiting the iniquities of the children, of the ancestors onto the children, up to the 3rd and 4th generations for those who scorn me. So, as my teacher writes, it's hard to read the statement here that God visits the iniquities of the parents on the children to be anything other than harsh. Because here, God is saying, don't do this sin, because if you do, watch out. So it doesn't make sense for him to say, because if you do, watch out, I'm going to spread out the sin over the next generations and make it easier for you. So that suggests that at least in these 10 commandments, the idea that God visits the sins of the parents onto the children really is a warning. And if that's the case, either Moshe was looking at it differently in his plea, or the reason why he brings it up or how he mentions it is for a different reason. So here, by reading the verses in Exodus, it kind of calls into question whether this is truly a merciful nature of God. And in fact, in Excursus 32, Milgram puts a fine point on it. In the Decalogue, a quality of mercy has no place in the demand for retribution. Here then, and he's now talking with Moshe's plea, it cannot mean a transfer of punishment, but its extension to the children. Thus, to judge by the Decalogue, there is no way the doctrine of retribution can be interpreted as an aspect of God's mercy. And something I kind of realized, if you think about it, there's really two parallel concepts. where we're told that God both visits the iniquity of the parents on the children up to 4 generations, but also that God bestows kindness for good deeds up to 1,000 generations. Well, if you say that that spreading of the iniquity to 4 generations means thinning it out, rather than each one getting, the first sinner getting full punishment and then still later generations get punished, if you're saying it spreads it out, does that mean the reward for good deeds also gets spread out over 1,000 generations? So we don't get as much good out of our benefit out of our good deeds as we might want? I think given that there's parallels on both sides, it would be a bit weird to read the punishment as a thinning of the punishment. That's kind of my 2 cents on this issue. Milgram argues that really Moshe isn't using these phrases for mercy. He talks about the meaning of the word salach as to keep God's covenant, and basically says that as long as God is going to keep God's relationship with the Israelite people, that's the key for Moshe, and that's what he's using Adonai Adonai Arachum V'Chanun for. And basically, as long as that works out, even if it comes with some negative repercussions as well, including the fact that God's nature involves punishing the progeny, Moshe is just willing to take that chance, so to speak. You take the good and you take the bad. Now, I would also note that if it's true that Poked Avon Avot means that God really punishes the next generation for the sins of the ancestor in a somewhat harsh way, then probably that argues to read Nakeh Lo Yinakeh, God doesn't acquit, more to say, yeah, God really doesn't let you off on your sins. So there are different ways, like we can use these different texts to kind of inform our understanding of each other, but we also have to keep in mind maybe one text had some different ideas, was getting at a different point, and so we need to do that fairly carefully. And so we have the possibility of reading God's visiting the iniquity in some very different ways. This is one of those shiurim that I'm not planning on giving any right answers to. Let me just, that kind of finishes a breaking point. Any questions or comments at this moment? Okay, if not, let me go on to the next piece. If I can get this to collapse again. Yeah, there we are. Okay. So here we are in the next question of God's punishing the next generation. Can they avoid it? And what does that mean? If we take it simply as the next generation, no matter what they do, they're going to have some comeuppance coming to them because of the misdeeds of their parents, that challenges our sense of fairness, to say the least. But there are ways to justify it. If, for instance, and I note this in one of my footnotes, if telling people that your progeny is going to suffer for your sins is enough of a deterrent for people to sin in the first place, we might be willing to accept that trade-off. So it's possible. So it's possible that you could justify this quality in different ways, if you will. We have first in the Torah we saw this concept: God visits the sins of the parents on the children. There are in the prophets some words that stress that each person should suffer for his or her own sins. Very famous phrase that we find in both Yechezkel and Ezekiel chapter 18, and also in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah, which is, we see here in verse 2 over here, the idea of Avot yochulu voser v'shinei banim tikena. And this is in the concept of Ezekiel saying, or God saying, why do you say this horrible thing? Nothing could be further from the truth. They say that fathers eat sour grapes and the teeth of the children are blunted, or some translate set on edge. And Yechezkel rejects this comment and rejects this proverb. And instead, for instance, in verse 20, he says, "Hanefesh hachoteh hi tamut, bein lo yisa ba'avon ha'av, ba'av lo yisa ba'avon ha'bein. Tzidkat hatzadik alav tihiyeh, v'rishat harasha alav tihiyeh. The soul that sins shall die, the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, and the father not bear the iniquity of the son. The righteous person's righteousness shall be upon him, and the evil doing of the evildoer shall be upon him." And Jeremiah basically says the same thing. So this kind of begs some questions. What do we do as between the idea that God visits the iniquities of parents on children, and here Ezekiel and Jeremiah saying that that sons don't suffer for the sins of the father? And there's a couple of strategies that I want to look at as far as that's concerned. The first is an idea that we see coming up in Rashi, and that gives one idea of how to deal with this. So Rashi says, on the words we read in the Decalogue, it said that God punishes the third and fourth generations, lisonai, to those who scorn me, which Rashi explains means that children get punished only when they hold on to the evil deeds of their ancestors. Kishe'ochazin ma'asei avotehem biyadehem, when they hold on to the acts of their ancestors. So in other words, the idea is that if a person who is an evildoer has a child who's an evildoer as well, the evildoer will get punished not only for that evildoer's bad deeds, but also for the bad deeds of the father. And similarly, we'll see the idea that someone who does good, their children, if their children are also good, will reap some of the reward for their good deeds. Now, this is a very reasonable read of the text. It somewhat, I think, turns on what does the word lisonai, when God says, I punish to the third and fourth generation for those who scorn me. Does that just mean the evildoer? In other words, someone does wrong, I'm going to get you and I'm going to get your generations. Or does lisonai mean as far as the progeny, that I'm going to punish, that I punish for up to the third and fourth generation when those next generations also are doing evil? And by the way, very similar language we have for do-gooders. For instance, I have in this footnote from Deuteronomy 7:9, and you shall know that the Lord your God is the faithful master, who keeps his covenant and kindness to those who love him and follow his commandments up to 1,000 generations. And you could easily read that as saying only if the next generations are good. So that's one way of looking at it. And by the way, it's very interesting in Yechezkel, after Yechezkel says, get rid of it, forget it, we're not having this idea that the ancestors eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are blunted, he goes on to illustrate by saying, if you have someone who's righteous and his child is an evildoer, that evildoer will die, and they're not going to get any benefit from their father being good. And similarly, if an evildoer has a son, and that son is a good person, then that son isn't going to suffer for the evil of his ancestors. But interestingly, Yechezkel never says explicitly what happens if a good person has a good child, or a bad person has a bad child. So there's at least some room to say, let's read Yechezkel and the Bible that talks about visiting the sins of the parents on the children. Let's look at them and argue that they're consistent, especially given the word lisonai. And we'll say that when Yechezkel was talking about no, everyone dies for their own sins, that's only when the next generation shapes up. So it's a reasonable read. It's a reasonable read of the text, and it allows the two texts to work well together. But there is another way of looking at it, and one that has some evidence in the Talmud as well. So we're going to take a look at a piece in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Brachot, which discusses this very issue and tells us about Rabbi Yossi's teaching. So what did Rabbi Yossi say? And I'm going to pick it up about 3 lines in. Moshe said before God, Master of the universe, why is there a righteous person who has good things happen to him, a righteous person who has bad things happen to him, a wicked person who has good things happen to him, and a wicked person that has bad things happen to him? So the age-old question, Sadiq Veralo. Why does a good person have bad things happen to him and vice versa? Okay, very common question. And listen to the answer that Rabbi Yossi says that God gives. God said to Moses, a righteous person who has good things happen to him is a righteous person, and the son of a righteous person. A righteous person who has bad things happen to him is a righteous person and the son of a wicked person. A wicked person who has good things happen to him is a wicked person, the son of a righteous person, and a wicked person who has bad things happen to him is a wicked person and the son of a wicked person. So according to Rabbi Yossi, if someone is good, and then so let's take it so he says a righteous person who has bad things happen to him, that's because he's a righteous person, the son of an evildoer. So that means that according to Rabbi Yossi, what Moshe is saying, yes, in fact, a good person may end up getting punished for the misdeeds of the parent. That is seemingly very different than the words of Yechezkel. And we'll see more about that in a moment. And we'll see that this same Talmud, by the way, the anonymous voice of the Talmud rejects this understanding and says, wait, you can't possibly say that. Is that really the way it goes? Because although we're told that God visits the iniquities of the ancestors on the children, we're also told, and here they quote a verse that probably is about an earthly court, but it could have easily quoted Ezekiel, fathers shall not be killed for the misdeeds of the children, and children shall not die for the misdeeds of the parents. And instead, what the anonymous voice of the Talmud ends up concluding is that if a righteous person suffers, that's because that righteous person isn't all that righteous. This is, by the way, see further Job. And if an evildoer has something good happen to him, maybe he's not that bad. Maybe he has some merit and he's getting rewarded for that. So that's kind of just interesting and to round out this piece of Talmud. But the key that I'm interested in here is that Rabbi Yossi tells us that a righteous person may well suffer for the good deeds of the ancestor, and also a wicked person may well receive reward for the good deeds of the past generation, which is consistent with Poked Avon Avot, with God visiting the sins on the children, but not with the interpretation that says that what Ezekiel meant was only if, that when Ezekiel says the good get theirs and the bad get theirs, it's just plain, it seems less, well, let's put it this way. This read doesn't support the idea, the justification that Rashi gave us, that progeny only suffer if they hold on to the evil doing of their parents. So this seems to break the attempt to, or it doesn't recognize the attempt to read the statements in Yechezkel as consistent with the visiting of iniquities of the parents, and says, no, when the Bible says that God punishes the children for the parents' deeds, yes, that happens, period, end of story. And probably when Yechezkel says, no, that doesn't happen, he means that doesn't happen in any circumstance. It doesn't matter whether the next generation is good or bad. They suffer reward and punishment based on their own merits. And in case this teaching of Rabbi Yossi doesn't, who brought, by the way, is Rabbi Yochanan who quotes Rabbi Yossi. In case this doesn't put a fine enough point on it, Rabbi Yossi Bar Hanina, who was a student of Rabbi Yochanan, says the following in Masechet Makot, in Tractate Makot. He says, there were 4 decrees which our teacher Moshe decreed upon Israel, which 4 prophets came and voided. For instance, so Gajar Moshe Rabbeinu al Yisrael, Ba'u Arba'a Nevi'im Ubitelum, and they voided them. Moshe said, visits the iniquities of ancestors on children. Ezekiel came and voided it, saying, the soul that sins shall die. So what we see here is we see 2 different approaches to these 2 texts. The Torah says the sins of the fathers are visited on the sons. Ezekiel says, no, everyone gets their own reward and punishment. One way of looking at that is to say, well, those 2 things are different. And Ezekiel is presenting a different concept of justice than what we saw in God telling Moshe. And maybe, different generation, a generation of prophets in a different reality, maybe look at things differently, and maybe God looks at things differently. And so that's one approach. The other approach is to say, well, if we have these 2 verses, let's see if we can make sense of one in light of the other. And the way they achieve that is by saying, well, when God says I punish the progeny, it's only when the progeny is evil as well, and God only rewards when the progeny is good as well. So 2 very different looks philosophically, both at how to look at text and how to read one text in light of the other, and 2 very different ideas of how divine justice works. I do have a 3rd section. I could go over it if people would like, or I can call it here and invite you to download the PDF and read it if you're interested. I also want to open up to questions. Let me invite anyone who wants to unmute and make any comments, questions, etc. Let me stop sharing for a moment. Let's see, there's something in the chat. Oh, Will said he had to run. Okay. Okay. He's back. He's still muted, but he's back. Okay. So I had opened up to see if anyone had any comments or questions. I do have a 3rd section, but I think I can leave it with. Let me just say very briefly. It has the very interesting observation that we're told to emulate God. And so if God visits the sins of the parents on the children, should we do that as well? And if we're told that God is vengeful, should we be vengeful as well? And the answer for the most part is no. But Rabbi Yosef Ibn Kaspi actually argues that, in fact, at least for some higher up philosophical people, they should do so. And so it's it's a very interesting thing that I invite people to study on the PDF. So any comments or questions there? Boy, I guess I dumbfounded everyone enough, huh? Excellent.
Well, confused us.
Well, I hope not, but I might have. But the good news is you have a PDF, and I think actually the PDF probably is a little bit clearer than I was here. But I think the key points to think about are to think about the ideas of justice behind punishment and punishment of children and how that works. And also the key idea of how to balance looking at texts each on their own, letting them live and breathe, but also letting one text enlighten the other. So I think we have to let each text live and breathe on its own, but also allow for other texts to supply some of that oxygen. And that really gives different challenges. And the nice thing that we see here is that the rabbis really grappled with these things and came to very different conclusions and different interpretations, and really looked at the nature of our texts and the balance between different texts very differently. And that's part of a living Torah. Let me close with the thought that today we are grappling with, on a societal level, what it means for children to suffer for not the sins of their ancestors, but at least to be the whole idea of the words of Ezekiel and Jeremiah are each person should have the opportunity to stand on his or her own 2 feet, to live and to succeed based on his or her own merit. And we are at a unique moment in history where many, many people are reflecting on that more than we might have otherwise, and to remember that part of our responsibility toward justice is to be a part of ensuring that people are able to succeed on their own and not to be condemned to tragedy and difficulty simply based on their accident of birth. I make it my rule not to make political prescriptions when teaching Torah, but I can make the value prescription that whatever we do and however we look at the political reality and what the right things and wrong things are to do, it should always be guided by the idea of ensuring that people's opportunities are based on not based on the content of their character and their deeds, and that they are given every opportunity to succeed regardless of what the past may have been. With that, I thank everyone for joining me and welcome any comments and questions, insights, and emails. And if you have time, you can, of course, print out for Shabbat to read further. Lots of fun footnotes and stuff like that. Thanks. So thank you, everyone.